workers, people who are living in situations that were already challenging and difficult. And I think that one of the things that this pandemic has done is unearthed in new ways, and ways that we already knew, the existing inequalities that organize so many of our societies and spaces, and that how global capitalism simply does not work for us, and it will not save us. And so I've been thinking a lot about solutions. I've been thinking a lot about how do we get through this? How do we get through these moments as a region, especially for our region, and thinking about solidarity in new ways. And the last week has been so intense, just knowing what is happening across the United States, across Canada, but also what's happening in Latin America, what's happening with Indigenous folks, what's happening with Black folks, and the pain and the rage. I feel it. It is heavy. And so that's where I am. I've been reading June Jordan's A Poem About My Rights for the last few days, and meditating on that, and in deep reflection with ancestors, and just thinking about how we get through this.
Yes, thank you, Angelique. And now I'm just going to put the question to Gabby and to Amina again, like what is alive for you right now? And so we'll start with Amina and then end with Gabby.
I'll be quick in the interest of time and just giving us space to start the discussion. But what I just wanted to say was, at least for me, I come at the current moment from a place of complete exhaustion, complete tiredness, complete overwhelm. I think what the pandemic has unearthed, as folks have said before, are things perhaps that we were too afraid to face. So for me, issues around, in particular, issues around support, around care, community, the systems that we have in our everyday lives have been shifted, have been kind of thrown on their head. So mechanisms of care, around, well-being, emotional well-being, around our mental health, around support, around childcare. All of these things have kind of just been turned on their heads. And for me, that has been a really, really challenging moment. And just trying to get through. And some of what the other sisters raised as well, in regard to just looking at the ways in which capitalism is crumbling, if I can phrase it in that way. And one of the things I had said before was just the sense that, we are angry, people are angry. And from where I sit, it's just this thought, this question that I'm meditating on, that I'm holding, this idea that Black love, Black joy, the way we love ourselves is not antithetical to our rage. And I think that what we're seeing, the reasons that folks are so angry, is precisely because we love ourselves. It's the fact that we want to see ourselves win. We want to see ourselves succeed. So those things are top of mind. And my daughter Nyla's on the call with us as well. Okay.
Welcome, Nyla. And Gabby, again, what is alive for you right now? You're muted.
Thanks for coming back. When we began, I talked about the question of hunger, and hunger across the Caribbean, which is weighing on my mind, I think, the most. All of the issues that everyone raised, I completely agree with, but for some reason, I keep coming back to hunger. I keep coming back to how are people going to feed themselves in December, and what's going to happen with the rates of hunger amongst children. And I had mentioned, in particular, the people working in our creative industries, our dancers, choreographers, artists, writers. And, we often talk about people in the informal economy in terms of expressing solidarity with domestic workers, with migrants who are working in retail and other sectors informally and so on. But we also do have to think about the groups such as our filmmakers and our musicians, and a group we don't often talk about, but who are living job to job, and who may just not have savings, may not have anything to fall back on. And I've been thinking about what happens to them when they're not able to buy food. And I don't quite know where I'm going with it, but that's what's been weighing on my mind. And I just want to echo and honor Amina's exhaustion, and to just kind of, recognize the fact that all over the region where children are not at school, somebody is performing the labor all day that would otherwise have been performed, well or not, by a school system, and that labor is exhausting, debilitating, prevents you from working, puts your child at risk, puts you at risk, and so on, and to recognize that as real as well.
Yes, thank you. And so I'm going to ask you another question, and instead of me inviting you individually to respond, I'll invite one person to start, and then I just invite you to sort of build on each other. So this moment that we're in is new to us in many ways, but there is so much that I think we can learn from previous moments of pandemic and crisis, particularly around how we understand and practice liberation. So thinking about the fact that, a pandemic does not stop Black death. It does not stop the state cutting down Black bodies on the streets. And so it forces us to still protest and organize. And so what can we learn about previous moments of pandemic and crisis about how we practice and understand liberation? What can a post-COVID Caribbean region look like? And so maybe we can start with Alissa, and then I just invite everyone to sort of build on each other.
Well, I think those are two separate questions. So I think maybe I leave the post-COVID Caribbean out for now. There's so much that can be said, but I think just thinking about a few examples, and I'll just throw them out without saying much more. I think we can look at what happened to Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria in 2017 and the incredible devastation. But what we also saw was people's power that led to the ousting of the governor, Ricardo Rossello, led to questioning of Puerto Rico's colonial relationship with the United States, led to people's assemblies all over the country, so the explosion of self-organizing activity on the ground. We can look at something like Sistren Theatre Collective during the Democratic Socialist period right up until the 1980s. Kamau Braffett wrote that art must come out of catastrophe, and George Lamming talks about the sovereignty of the imagination. So these incredible cultural workers, grassroots women, going into community, putting on plays, drawing on women's experiences to reshape the narrative and to get people to think about their realities in order to sort of challenge and overturn them. We can think about Guyana, which is where I'm from, in 2005, with floods that displaced 40% of the population, and Red Thread, which is a grassroots women's organization that was turned to by hundreds and hundreds of women, Black, Indigenous, Indian, coming for support. They ended up turning that into an example of women's power, where they demanded something from the Guyanese state, from the international community, from their own communities. They organized and turned what could have been a charitable set of responses into a call for solidarity. And the final thing I want to just give an example of is, this incredible podcast that I listened to over the weekend, Wajang Discotheque, that is curated by Trinidadian Attila Springer, so that we have these examples of archiving and using. And the Wajang Discotheque, their latest podcast was actually around Black power, revisiting and returning to that moment, retelling the story, thinking about the quieter things that are not usually talked about when we think about Black power in the Caribbean. So the Afro-Indo solidarity, the space and role of women and the role of social reproduction, or we could think of the Grenada Revolution, the importance of participatory budgets. If we had that now, if we had that kind of organizing at a community level, would we have been better prepared in this current moment? I think we would have been. So I think there's lots that we can look at for that kind of history. And I think what Attila is doing in terms of that archiving work is really important, because we need to go back to those moments in order to think about what we do now.
I said I wasn't going to invite you in. I just wanted you to just run with it. So please,
go ahead, Gabby. You're off mute. Go ahead.
two things I wanted to say. One thing I think we've learned from past crises is that we must be attentive to the fact that corporate power and political and economic elites will want to control the recovery in their own interests. And that to me is another thing weighing on my mind. You know, there are some basics, hunger is one. But that, you know, how do we, you know, when we look at the 2008, 2009 crisis, you know, and the movements that had an opportunity, but the return to an oligarchic, exploitative, extractive, financialized system that was, you know, just as bad and in many ways even more entrenched than before. I think, how do we prevent the elites and those that control the corporate and state interests from determining the steps ahead? And that for me is a really big one. There's been excellent work on the ground in Trinidad. The Elma Francois Institute has been running series on workers' rights. You know, workers' rights are not locked down in a COVID, and, you know, remembering to keep that alive. So I just want to say, controlling the narrative, or resisting control of the narrative at this time, resisting the idea that we can only imagine so big, resisting the idea that the recovery can only realistically be these things and not other things. For me, that's important, because we know everything can change. We know everything can stop. We can stop the airlines, we can close the borders, we can stop consuming fossil fuels. We know that everything can change. And so it's amazing to me how out of that, the bigness of that moment, we can then get contained into these recovery strategies that are narrow and IMF defined and incredibly structured to return the order of an exploitative system. And that's the first thing. And the second thing that I think we need to learn out of previous pandemics and crises of various kinds is the need to battle for women's inclusion, for women's leadership, and for women's voice. And so, and for the diversity of women, working class women, women of different ethnicities, indigenous women, and so on. And that is because we have certainly found in Trinidad that the recovery is treated as a war, and you're supposed to let men lead the war. I know it's not the same in Barbados, where we have Mia Motley, who's been amazing in so many things that she's said, but it's not just about women elites or elite women or, having that capacity to speak to policymakers. It's also about the leadership that, for me, working class women have in needing to have a say at the table where decisions are being made about our future as Caribbean economies at a very pivotal moment, the most pivotal moments in our history, where climate change is on the one hand destroying us, and on the other hand, we're returning to the old modes of vulnerability simultaneously. And so the two lessons for me are around not letting the narrative be taken from us and controlled for us, and defending women's rights to sit at the table in all their diversity.
Thank you so much, Gabby. And I'll jump right in. I mean, one of the things that has been really top of mind, it's a quote. Kimalee will probably be tired of hearing me use this quote, but I think it's really meaningful, particularly in this moment. And it is that Arundhati Roy quote where she says, "Another world is not only possible, she is on her way. On a quiet day, I can hear her breathing." And I think that is what we have witnessed in the past couple of months, that the world is quiet, that we can hear the world breathing. And I think one of the things that really strikes me is that something has to give. We cannot go back to the way things used to be. I really don't like the word the new normal, because I don't think that that is the world that we are creating. I think that that's the interim period that we have tried to float through, that COVID has led us to. But I think one of the things that we can learn from previous liberation struggles, that we can learn, is the importance of strategy, the fact that we have to come together. And from where I sit, that is really kind of top of mind in the context of Caribbean feminist movement building. The sense that we cannot work in silos, we cannot work, country to country, that this moment provides a real opportunity where the North is practically crumbling, for more South to South interaction, for more sharing, more modes of real learning and building and growing together. I think that this is the opportunity that it provides us. And I think one of the things that what we know is that we cannot be dependent on the systems that really benefit from our struggles, right? So whether it be the state, whether it be donors, whether it be, whomever we have been sort of reliant upon to kind of enable us to do our organizing, enable us to have our NGOs and our organizations and support our movements, that cannot be the forefront of how we imagine the future. We really have to think, particularly as a Caribbean region, what do we mean when we're talking about sustainability of our organizations, of our people? The fact that the women primarily who, in many ways are the frontline workers, but the women in our community who are leading organizations, they are tired, as I said, they are exhausted. They are doing double, triple, quadruple labor, whether it be in the home, whether it be in their communities, wherever. And so the fact is, when we think about a post-COVID Caribbean, I know you mentioned that part of the question. For me, it is one where we have to be sustainable. We have to have systems in place that enable sustainability. We have to think about, from where I sit, resource mobilizing as a central tenet in the way we imagine our organizing. We cannot continue to rely on, state handouts and grants. Gabby was saying, how will people eat in December? The question we're faced here with is, how will people eat in August? Hurricane season is about to start. That brings a whole amount of uncertainty and fear. And the fact that also impacts people's mental and emotional well-being. There's so many factors that are connected here. And so for me, I think what's central in what we can learn from previous struggles is this idea that we have to be smart, we have to strategize, we have to see each other as a resource, and we have to work together. I mean, that for me is the heart of it. And I think one of the things that I have really loved have been the Caribbean conversations that have been happening, and folks who have been able to access online have been accessing organizations like We Change in Jamaica that have been leading some of these discussions have been really meaningful. The questions that have come to mind around economic dependence, around the fact that tourism is no longer everybody's business in the way that it has been. And many of our countries, Antigua is one example, is almost entirely dependent on tourism. What are the questions that this interim period we're calling the new normal is asking of us? I think I'll leave it there and pass on to Angelique.
Yeah, and Angelique, before you jump in, I just want to remind listeners that you just heard Amina Doherty speak, who's calling in from Antigua and Barbuda. And also on the call, we have Alissa Trotz, who's calling in from Toronto, Gabrielle Hosein, who's calling in from Trinidad and Tobago, and you're about to hear Angelique Nixon, who's also calling in from Trinidad and Tobago. And we're talking about Caribbean feminist reflections, liberation within a time of COVID. So Angelique, I'll pass it on to you.
Thanks so much, Kimalee, and thanks, Amina, for your provocations, because those are very similar to the things I've really been thinking about. Tourism in particular, how do we think about something different? And I'm really concerned that, conversations happening in Jamaica and the Bahamas and Antigua and places that are overly dependent on tourism, we're just waiting to open back up, right? And get business started again. And that's so scary to me. One, because once borders are opened and tourism begins again, that inevitably we will get more cases. And that is going to be a strain on our healthcare systems and everything. And so, what I've been thinking about a lot is that we have an opportunity to radically change our structures and to really develop a different kind of economic recovery. Thinking about what Amina said about sustainability and making sure that our vision and our strategies of sustainability are grounded in gender, race, and class analyses that are very clear to think about the structural inequalities that so many of our countries are still grappling with, our colonial the lingering colonial structures. We have to think about food sovereignty. We have to think about investing in feeding ourselves. And one of the things that I've written about a lot and thought deeply about is what does our local investment look like, and regional investment? What if we look to each other, that south to south solidarity and investment in each other as a region? And I thought that, envisioned that with this COVID moment, with travel being halted, that it would give us an opportunity as a region to really think about that. How do we invest in our healthcare systems, in our school systems, in our emergency services, which are more important now than ever? I mean, one could argue that we shut down so quickly because all of our countries knew in a way, wait, our healthcare systems can't actually take this. And so we must shut down, we must close the borders. And so with that same energy, knowing that the countries that had enough funds to really think about, okay, we need to make sure that everyone is okay, even, with some of the challenges of accessing those social services, which some members of our communities have had issues getting that access, but at least it was made available because we knew. And now, we're here and it seems as if we're opening back up. And, my vision of post-COVID, I mean, I don't know if we'll ever be post-COVID, but what we could be doing is that we really think about, how do we feed ourselves? How do we heal ourselves? How do we support each other across local and region and our local economies, but our regional economy? We can think about some kind of vision for that and really decreasing our vulnerability through regional mutual aid, through ways that we can share resources and our growing and investing in food production, and rejecting foreign aid, as Amina is talking about, rejecting the neoliberal agendas that keep us dependent, because dependency capitalism is not going to serve us. It has not served us, and it certainly is not going to serve us, I think, in these as we move through this COVID recovery period. And I wanted to come back to what Gabby was saying about leadership. I really think, too, that how do we think about a shared leadership vision that is inclusive, that includes more people at the table saying we want to participate and create and give ideas and share our ideas for what investing in local economy and transforming our societies. What does that look like? What does inclusive decision making look like, especially with those who are most marginalized? And of course, bringing as much diversity into that vision and idea of participatory governance. So my vision is sustainable and decolonial justice, and we really need to prioritize that, because we can't just be surviving, or this idea of we're just trying to survive. I think, what does our liberation look like? And what we've learned from liberation movements in the past is that people in power don't give it up easily, and so it is going to be a struggle, and it is going to be a battle, and it might be a long one, but this is our opportunity to grasp it and create the change that we want to see.
Thank you, Angelique. A lot of what all of you have shared is actually demanding that we take risks, that we be bold, that we be brave and courageous, and not do things the way we were doing it. I don't know which Caribbean prime minister will be the first to reject foreign aid, but that will be interesting to see. And I think it does, the foreign debt that Caribbean nations owe to international financial institutions and foreign governments it's outstanding, and it's exploitative. And I just want to read from the statement that I mentioned on the call earlier. This statement was produced by Caribbean feminists and activists, some of whom participated in an open access online course called Organizing to Live. It looks at Caribbean society, economy, and ecology. And you can access the course materials. It's open access. We'll put the links in the YouTube and the Facebook chats. Yes, Amina. But I'm just going to read 3 paragraphs from this statement, and I do invite you to read the full statement. It is beautiful, it's profound, it's critical. We cannot and should not return to business as usual when the business model that continues to drive much of Caribbean development is ecologically and economically destructive, making us more vulnerable than ever before to the ravages of climate change. It is time to draw lessons from the strengths and achievements of our region. We do best when we take care of each other, when we express our culture, when we support creativity, and when we honor our rebellious history, refusing to be complacent about inequalities. We must reject emphasis on the individual at the expense of the relations through which we sustain life. We must reject externally imposed ideas at the expense of Caribbean-rooted common sense and knowledge born of centuries of survival and resistance. Most importantly, we need to think as a region working together in solidarity and with care and compassion. We should draw lessons from and be inspired by the Cuban decision to send medical personnel across the Caribbean and beyond while facing massive shortages and in the face of a deepening U.S. embargo on even the shipment of medical supplies to their shores. These are the principles upon which a truly independent Caribbean will be founded and our collective security assured. In such a time as this, we must cleave together in the greater sense of commonality of struggle and reject the continuation of inhumane and unconscionable sanctions that impose further hardships on poor and working people in our region and beyond. A beautiful and powerful statement that was drafted by Caribbean feminists and activists, and I do invite you to please read it and share. So we are at 7:45. We did want to put aside some time for questions and answers from folks. Many of you are listening in patiently. So I just want to invite the panelists to maybe you've started speaking a bit about what solidarity can look like within the region and also outside of the region. But I just want to open it up to you if there is anything you just want to add. It doesn't have to be related to any question that I've asked you or that we've discussed. And so maybe we can start with Angelique. Angelique, just anything. Is Angelique still on? Let me just make sure you're still here. Yeah. So Angelique, if you just want to share any closing thoughts, any last reflections that you want to make sure the audience goes home or thinks about a bit further.
Thanks so much. That statement is so powerful. I just think that we all need to, join movements, join organizations that exist that you feel aligned with. Think about, be up to our work, figure out what your work is. And I think we also, so that's part of it, how do we figure out our work, be active in it? And then also, how are we holding governments and our leaders accountable? I think that we have such a problem across the region of accountability, of people abusing power, of all kinds of levels of complicity in our structures and systems. They don't work for us, so let's rebuild them. We made we've created a lot of this. We've participated in it. Some of it is lingering from the past. Some of it, of course, is colonialism, the structures. But I just want to urge all of us to figure out how we can participate in the complete dismantling, destruction, and recreation of the structures and systems that don't serve us. I mean, Sylvia Wynter says we can't even trust our own consciousness. That's how deep we have to go in our decolonizing of our mind, body, spirits, and selves. And then we need to do that to our structures. And I know that sounds like a lot, but I mean, I really think that we have to do that. We can't go back. And so however we can prepare ourselves and join forces and do really deep regional movement building and engage diaspora and do this work.
Thank you, Angelique. Gabby, you want to go next?
Two things. Again, I mean, there's always so much to say, but I'll just choose a couple. One is I'm spending a lot of time thinking about the digital divide. My daughter is in school, she's 9, and she's getting excellent online teaching through her school, the university school here in St. Augustine. And there isn't a single day that I don't see her online getting excellent synchronous teaching that I don't think about the tens of thousands of children who have not been in school for these months, and not just the tens of thousands of children who are relying on a meal when they get to school, who are relying on order, sanity, options for their mind to develop, that teacher who inspires them, those children outside of their own personal context who they are able to develop different relationships with than they might from their family. And I think for the region, we have a lot of work to do in terms of being truthful about the implications of the digital divide for people. The wealthy will either stay sufficiently wealthy, and some will get wealthier, but the poor are going to get poorer in our region. And I think particularly about the digital divide between children. And children of privilege will remain privileged, and children who are not, that the gap will grow between them. And that's something that's really stood out to me. And I want us to think about that in terms of children, not just in terms of people and groups and communities. And so the digital divide and how that's setting up another generation to start from a place of increased inequality in relation to each other. The second thing I just want to signal is the idea of debt. For decades, we have written about, spoken about, theorized, analyzed, challenged, showed the damage that debt has done. And all we are entering is a phase in the region when we know for 40 years what debt has done to cripple us, and what follows debt is structural adjustment. And we can see it like an oncoming disaster, and in the context of our increasing financial debt and vulnerability, and therefore lack of control of our national economies, is the kind of disaster capitalism that we're so familiar with, where those who are coming in to take national wealth, to privatize, to benefit from the nurturing that's happened, and so on. And so I think back to Norman Girvan, I think back to the New World Group, I think back to Dawn and the Feminist Network, and we must return again to reminding people of the injustice of debt, because that is the space that we are entering as a region over the next decade. And finally, I just want to say that we call on and we call on and we call on to do better and to organize and to support each other. And yet I think so many people just want to just stop and just not have to do more, do better, just for a few minutes. And I want to particularly talk, acknowledge the work of the women's movement in doing more, in doing better, in extending themselves further, and to just remind ourselves that labor, that kind of labor, is depleting personally. It comes at a sacrifice to themselves. It comes at a sacrifice to their own children, to their own families, and that to their own motherhood, to their own everything, their multiple identities. And we need to take seriously the costs, as Colin Robinson would say, as Angelique would know, the cost of pursuing justice, the costs of seeking justice. And let us remind ourselves as we call on Caribbean people to rise up and seek justice evermore, that the costs of that are real. And so sometimes people slow down, or sometimes they hide at home, or sometimes they just can't do. And to recognize that as part of the daily life of negotiating inequality in our region.
Thank you, Gabby, so much. Thank you. This is Amina. I'll be quick to make sure Alissa has enough time. I think from where I sit, what's top of mind, and everything that's been said already, of course, I could talk about accountability, the digital divide. I kind of want to just bring us to a place where we talk about where Gabby left off around the women's movement, and the fact that, oftentimes, and I've been talking to folks around the Caribbean for a little over a year now, where you hear activists say, we are tired, we are exhausted, we have been mobilizing, activating, agonizing for years and years and years. And so what does the current moment bring us? It does bring moment to be reflective, but it also, I think, really, I'm hopeful that it gives us a moment to really rethink, what is needed next, and to rethink a way of movement building and organizing that really care, that centers I think is deeply for our government that say, I see me, here's what I'm struggling with. Those are the kind of questions you, those are the kind of questions that has how we engage the philanthropy community, whether it be the usual suspects or engaging and also with a real focus around thinking about how do we support the community, how do we support the region in a way that isn't dependent, how do we support the region in a way that really lifts up sustainability. That's the point that I raised earlier. And I think for folks who are following, who are listening, something that I really always love to share is a document produced by Australia called the Feminist Funding Principles. And it talked a little bit about, what is the core of how we support each other? How do we think about sustainability in a way that's not dependency, in a way that is not burdensome, in a way that or building that you're in, or to be able to support, three young activists to do whatever the case may be. The fact is, there are feminist funders who see themselves as part of a movement and who are really committed to supporting Caribbean organizing and Caribbean feminist organizing. So to see those folks as allies in our work, and to see those folks as who have, by virtue of whatever the case may be, access to resources, to see those folks as folks who can help us in thinking as we think of a way forward. I just want to put that on the table. I know there's a lot to discuss and a lot to unpack when I raise those things, but I think it's important to recognize that we are not alone in this work, and there are folks that are committed to doing the support, to doing the work to support us to get to where we need to be. I think the last thing that I'll say is just that what I know is that we are resilient, and I don't mean that in a way that we will always come out of things, but I think we are, as a region, the Caribbean is a resilient region, and I think we are full of responsible people. I think that that's the heart of how we move forward. That's the heart of building on that creativity, building on the fact that we are brave. I think that's the only way we can imagine a way forward, because ultimately I think we cannot be dependent on old ways of living, on the state, on things on things and people that were not built to serve us.
Mm-hmm.
All
yeah, a lot. Such a this vision and visioning and brilliance, and I'm going to do more there. I mean, so many women across the region in terms of funding have been limping from project to project to project, and there's never anything that is about sustaining the work that they do. The burnout is just incredible and exhausting. We are not miracle women in the Caribbean. We just recognize and stay with that exhaustion. I just want to sort of say a few things. One is that, what the sisters on this call have sort of talked about, the digital divide, the sort of infrastructural gaps that have been revealed by the pandemic. A few weeks ago, Barbados sister, Marcia Hines, who is the president of the National Organization of Women in Barbados. She was talking about domestic violence. It could have been in relation to any of this. And she said, COVID highlighted the crisis, but in my neck of the woods, it really isn't the crisis. And we could think of that in so many ways, you know. Social reproduction was already unevenly distributed before the pandemic. I that women who were in work was true, but it was highly unevenly distributed in the sense that under adjustment programs, the bulk of social reproduction has been privatized. And we're feeling the effects now in terms of the devastating state of infrastructure, public infrastructure, in terms of the absolute lack of social provisioning for health, for education. All of those wounds have been laid bare by the pandemic, but those were wounds that started to be inflicted from the 1980s with the imposition of structural adjustment across the region. In terms of the hunger that Gabby talks about, it's a hunger that has to do with the fact that 90% of our food supply in the Caribbean comes from the United States. The Caribbean was already a food insecure region before the pandemic. 11 CARICOM countries import more than 50% of the food that we consume. And our food import bills have jumped 50% since 2000 to over about $4 billion. So these are the things that we have to think about. And Gab was right when she said earlier that the pressure right now is to return to normal that has always left out the majority of the Caribbean people. Mia Mottley has been saying great things. When she spoke with Christiane Amanpour, I was cheering as well. But have folks had a look at her investment plan for Barbados of April 2019? We should be asking whether Mia Mottley's government intends to go down that path. I only just started looking at it, and it is pretty shocking because it really is about making Barbados a tourist paradise. That's the model. That is the model. And so these are the things that we really need to challenge our leaders on. And that's the last thing I'll say, because there's so much more one can say, is that what we need to understand is that we're facing the coloniality of state power across the Caribbean. That's what we're dealing with. A coloniality of state power where Caribbean people are shut out of dominant political and economic arrangements. The Jamaican sisters have been organizing these amazing sessions. And last week I was privileged to be on a call, and there was Lana Finnegan from Sistren, and there was I think the sister was Susan Uta from Jamaica Rural Women Producers, and there was Shirley Price from the Domestic Workers Union, and there was Shauna Stewart from We Change Jamaica. You didn't have to scratch hard. These women were incredible. They had ideas which came out of organizing and working with other folks. So what y'all were saying about being at the table, the creativity, the self-organizing capacity, the ideas, that is all there. What we are facing are a set of exclusionary political and economic arrangements. And frankly, it's time that we take our damn Caribbean back. And by the way, the last thing I want to say, it's a Caribbean we have to take back that includes Cuba, includes Venezuela, includes the Dominican Republic, where folks may not know because everyone's saying the Caribbean is past the pandemic, places are opening up. Dominican Republic has 17,285 cases of COVID as of June 1st, 502 fatalities. So when we're talking about the Caribbean, are we remembering folks in Haiti, in the Dominican Republic? Are we remembering folks in Martinique and Guadeloupe? So we need to think about building something that really sort of engages conversations across all kinds of divides, including the difficult linguistic ones. And a big shout out to Hope McNeish and others who yesterday organized a conversation across Latin America and the Caribbean, because that is more of what we need.
Thank you so much. Hey, okay, we have a few questions. 3 of the questions speak to how can folks in the diaspora support communities, families, and those back home. And what is the common thread of questions is it's not just about sending money back home. They're asking really about like how can this not be a top-down approach? How can it actually be a process that builds solidarity and builds collective power? So I'll ask the questions all together because I'm trying to group them. So all in all, I would say there are really 3 questions for now. There's that question about how we support the diaspora, how the diaspora can support back home in ways that are built on principles of solidarity. There's also a question from Honor Ford Smith, who's asking, could you see a connection between rising going now in North American cities and other cities around the world and the way forward? And I know some of you spoke a bit about that earlier. And finally, and I'll repeat this if you need me to, the third question is about exhaustion and burnout that comes with activism, and how do we balance the need to protect our lives with the fact that we need to protect our lives on an individual basis to do that kind of self-collective care, but also how do we balance that with the activism that is so crucial and needed? So do you want me to repeat those three questions, or do you think you've got it? And then just let me know. Everyone seems like you got it. And so it's at 8:04 now. If we can maybe do like a minute per person, or like a minute and 15 seconds. And Angelique, do you want to start?
How you come up with a minute and 15 seconds?
Minute and 15 seconds. I'll just talk about the burnout in doing this work and activism, I think, because maybe I also feel exhausted. I think that it's really important now more than ever for us to figure out ways to sustain ourselves. And I've been really thinking about this connection between the community care and the community work that we want to do. And that, of course, is rooted in our self-care, as Audre Lorde reminds us again and again when we go back to her work, that it is an act of political resistance to take care of ourselves. But that also means when we take care of ourselves, we take care of our community. And so I think that means that we have to be self-aware enough and conscious enough to be able to, one, reach out and activate our circles, our families, our loved ones, our partners, and then also figure out a way that when we restore ourselves, then we could show up as best we can for the work. And, I'm learning. Healing is a process. And I think we all do it to ourselves. We promise that we're gonna be rejuvenated and go back into it. But I think these moments with COVID, the lockdown, all of the crises upon crises that we've been in, disasters after disaster, I think it's a reminder. And I think that that's where the solidarity comes in too, is ways that we can create. I think what Alissa was talking about earlier, how we activate around the region to connect and to build community and organizing solidarity, and to make sure that we're thinking about Haiti and Dominican Republic and Cuba in our movement building, and that we think about how diaspora can be activated not just as remittances, which that we need something more sustainable. And I think maybe sustainability is the key here as we think about our connection to each other, the earth, and how we do this work. And it's not going to be easy. And I was hearing what Alissa was saying about traveling tourism. We eat much food in the really high amounts of the spaces that have lots of tourists. We food, we feed the tourists in. And so that's the part of the problem. And we apart that system. If we can break apart that, that also can help us think about living differently and not being dependent.
Yes, thank you, Angelique. Amina, I heard you yesing in the background.
No, I was saying yes, and I was snapping my fingers and saying yes, because I was saying, it's not since COVID since I've had the freshest locally grown vegetables, and that's because whatever we had, fruits and vegetables, went straight to the hotel, right? So us locals never really got the benefit of all of the very fresh, locally produced, tropical, if you will, fruits and vegetables. So echoing exactly what Angelique was saying there. I'm not going to take a lot of time, just to say that I think in terms of diaspora support and connections, I think the most important thing is similar to what we're having here: conversations, opening space, creating space, opening doors, having platforms where the conversation can be much more wide-reaching. Tune in to the sessions that are being held across the region, whether they be organizations in Jamaica, Grenada, Antigua. Participate. I think there are ways now, once folks have access to the virtual networks, to engage, to learn, to share, to grow with each other. And I think that's really, the heart of this work is learning from each other, building with each other, growing together. I think, in addition to thinking again about that question around sustainability, it's not just about remittances and financial support in some of the ways that I think oftentimes comes top of mind to people, but really thinking about where do you sit in the community that you work in? How can you make connections? How can you support organizations that are doing the work across the region, find out about the organizations that are doing the work across the region, and tune into those networks. I think the piece on self-care, exhaustion, activism, I really, really loved what Angelique said about activating our circles. I think, again, based on what I said earlier, COVID has made that, very, very difficult to do. But one of the things that I am learning personally is to ask for what you need. So if what you need is space, if what you need is a timeout, if what you need is someone to drop off something for you and not have any conversation because you're not in the headspace to have a conversation, just to ask for what you need, and to understand that people will understand what it is that you need if you're clear yourself. So I am learning that. I can't say that I've got it, down pat, but I am definitely learning to ask for what I need.
Yes, please do. Please do. Gabby, you want to jump in?
Yeah, so not to repeat anything that's been said, but something a little different. Actually, I think money is important for the diaspora, to be honest. We have shelters that are looking for money to stay alive, to stay open. I think rather than us, we obviously, but while we continue to demand that they get subventions, building our communities wherever they exist, and providing the kind of community support that grounding of Caribbean communities, when we had friendly societies, when you have susus, when you have, shared sources of financial communities, that part of Caribbean history, right? And, we have women's organizations, they were membership organizations, so you pay your $1 or whatever, and an organization is sustained by its membership. And so for me, yes, in fact, the funds are important. In fact, all around the region, we have a responsibility to support the work going on in the region ourselves. And so Amina can tell you about, we don't want to be dependent on the funders, who are Canadians or Europeans or, work Americans with their rules. There are organizations we can this in Jamaica. Think about E for Life, how E for Life is looking for money to deal with young girls who've experienced child sexual abuse, who have ended up having to care for their own children, who are HIV positive. I think personally that yes, supporting our own organizations around the region is one very important thing. Money is certainly not the only thing. Helping and organizing, being open to the movements when they're Caribbean defined. But yes, that is one thing I'd like to say. And in relation to I want to say my column on Wednesday, which I'm trying to figure out what are the right words for. It has to do just to reference something Honor said, the idea of solidarity. On May 30th, which was Indian Arrival Day, certainly for Trinidad and Tobago, I was busy thinking about the necessity for non-Black people like myself to be explicit in the Caribbean about articulating solidarity with the preciousness of Black lives and with the risk that they are facing. And so for me, continuing to call on us who are, outside of Black Caribbean communities, outside of Black African American communities and so on, to be explicit in our solidarities with the impact that white supremacy has on Black lives is necessary. And that'll be in my column on Wednesday. And finally, to say, from where I sit at the University of the West Indies, we can talk about grassroots, all the people that need us, but sometimes you don't expect that our institutions, our regional institutions that we have fought and built and loved and produced thousands of graduates across the region, that even our institutions are fighting. And you can say, be anarchist and say our institutions don't matter, we can do autonomous teaching, but we are also fighting to keep our own institutions alive and premier and ours and self-defined and the places that they always were. And so, while we can't do all the work and the exhaustion is real, we're also defending our own wherever it is we are.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. And I guess I'll answer, maybe I'll just take the first two, because I think everyone has just spoken so eloquently in the last one. And it was wonderful to see Naila on the call. We were kind of joking but not quite, with Amina, and saying, turn your camera on, let's do a time use survey out of this call so that we can make clear the work of social reproduction, the labor of social reproduction, and think about what it would mean to organize our economies around care, right? Around care and solidarity and sociality. But I agree with everything everyone has said, and especially what Gab just said there about money. And the other thing I want to say is with respect to, so I'll just say two things. One is with respect to diaspora. You know, governments in the Caribbean had already begun mobilizing diaspora in very instrumental and neoliberal ways, very clear that they wanted to think about the diaspora in ways that would help to sustain contemporary economic arrangements in the Caribbean. And so I think it is not a given. We have to think about this as a way of harnessing the power of the diaspora to do things differently. And one example just over the last couple of weeks that Kimalee, I think you're aware of, is the work between the Caribbean Solidarity Network and Justice for Migrant Workers, raising awareness in the region and in Canada about the situation facing migrant workers who are still coming from Jamaica. And I think possibly there's some discussion about Barbados, but coming to Canada, and it turned out that they were being asked to sign waivers in Jamaica before they left, absolving the Jamaican government of any responsibility for them if they got sick or died, right? And one person, a Mexican, has just died here today. And did this amazing work raising awareness of the conditions before the pandemic, housing and otherwise, that led to the impossibility of physically distancing, observing physically distancing guidelines and all of that. But it also resulted in working with folks in Jamaica like Carolyn Cooper, who has a column. We got an article into the newspapers there. Some of the activists were on air in Jamaica, along with former farm workers and the wife of a current farm worker, because of the levels of intimidation and fear that your contract wouldn't be renewed. Contemporary farm workers are obviously really scared to go on camera. But the fact is that was a great example of solidarity between the Caribbean and the diaspora. But I just wanted to spend my last 2 minutes answering Honor's really important question about the connection between the uprisings in North America and the Caribbean, because Honor, I'm not sure if you were to call at the start when we were asked what was alive for us, and I began by saying that what was alive for us was George Floyd. And just before this call started, my dad had texted me to say that the independent autopsy report had come in, and my response was like, there's going to be an explosion tonight, and why should there not be? It's unbelievable. And that we're thinking right here in Canada of being out on the streets on Saturday over Regis Korchinski Parquet. I guess I say all that because the connection between North America and the connection in the Caribbean for me runs in these two ways. The first way is that our solidarity is best when we start raising bloody questions about state violence in the Caribbean. So the anniversary of Tivoli, the murder of Susan Bogle. I'm going to call it murder because but Jamaicans for Justice and Indicom are now involved with the death of Susan Bogle last week, who's disabled and in her house and is shot by a bullet that comes from a joint military and police patrol. That's what we need to be talking about. We need to be talking about the deaths of the Black genocide right in our region in Brazil, right? The murder of Marielle Franco, LGBT Brazilian Black woman politician, because she was calling out the deaths as a result of state violence, and that is ongoing right now with a fascist president who refuses to back down in the face of the epidemic of death that is happening, whether the pandemic or state violence in Brazil. In Guyana, where I'm from, we could talk about the state violence against Black men, the torture of Colwyn Harding years ago, the burning of the genitals of a young Guyanese, a teenager, Tywin Thomas. One could go on. So part of our solidarity has to be asking hard questions about our Caribbean, which is not disconnected from questions of US imperialism. So transnational solidarity and thinking diasporically is important. And the other thing I want to say, completely agree with Gab there around what does it mean? And I say this coming from Guyana, where March 2nd we had an election, there's still no resolution, and the racial tensions are at an all-time high. And so how does one cope with that in a context of what's unfolding in North America? What we need to do is to remember moments of African Indian solidarity. So Attila Springer's beautiful Wajang discotheque on Black Power, or the movements in the 1970s in Guyana between the Indian Political Revolutionary Associates and the African Society for Cultural and Independent Relations with Independent Africa, movements of landless people to occupy land because they needed homes. Or to remember in Groundings with My Brothers, where Walter Rodney talked about what Black Power meant in the context of a multiracial Caribbean, that it begins always with the people who are shut out of power, and that for him coming back to a place like Guyana, that we had to think of solidarity between Black and brown people, starting always with the grassroots and the working people, those who are shut out and whose capacities will ultimately free us all. Thanks.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Alissa. Thank you so much, Amina. Thank you, Nyla. Thank you, Gabby. Thank you, Angelique. Can
we see Nyla one more time?
Nyla, come through, baby. Show your face.
Hold on, let me find her. Come say hello.
Hi, Nyla. Bedtime.
Oh,
bedtime.
Yeah, that's a hint. Time to go.
And it's for babies like Nyla that we will continue to fight. It is for ourselves right now, living right now. We will continue to fight. It's for our ancestors who fought, struggled, survived, died, that we will continue to fight. And I think the statement that we published together, that was released, that is available on the website dedicated to Andai. We'll put the link for you. It's on our Caribbean Solidarity Network website. The question that Andai asked us to think about, how do we organize to live? And I think that word, or organize, is so key. We're not just talking about talking to each other. We're not just talking about, ranting. We're talking about organizing. And I know it's really hard to do that right now because we don't have that face-to-face, in-person ability. But we must never forget that it is only through organizing and building and sustaining our lives and our movements that we will win. And so I just want to say thank you so much to everyone for joining us. Thank you for all of the questions and the participants. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of your questions. Thank you to my comrades at the Caribbean Solidarity Network for holding it down behind the scenes. And I just want to say again, thank you to Alissa. Thank you, Gabby. Thank you, Angelique. Thank you, Amina. And hopefully this is just the first of many conversations that we will have. And if you want to get involved with the Caribbean Solidarity Network, you're more than welcome. If you want to build your own organization and movement, we can support you in doing that. And there are organizations willing to fund your work. So with that said, thank you, good night, and we will be in touch. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Thanks so much.